Hi, I'm Bill Kristol. Welcome back to Conversations. Very pleased to be joined again today by Larry Summers, the former Secretary of the Treasury, top economic advisor to President Obama as we came out of the financial crisis, university professor at Harvard, and we've had two excellent conversations about economics with Larry, and I look forward to this one as well. So thank you, Larry, for joining me.
Good to be with you, Bill.
So let's get right to it. You've been involved in the debates about stimulus package, but much more broadly on the general economic situation, what has to be done, what doesn't have to be done for our economy. And I mean, why is the following wrong? We'll get the vaccines out, we'll get back to work, and we'll get back to something close to full employment and a good, decent economic growth. And is there really a problem? What's the problem here? Why do we need to be worrying so much about different forms of either relief or infrastructure or government action in general? Why isn't just solving the pandemic enough?
So I think there's a lot in what you said, Bill. The biggest failure of the U.S. public sector in 2 generations has been the 500,000 people who have died so far of COVID. The way historians will ultimately remember this moment is that the autocracies of the East succeeded in containing this problem, and the democracies of the West failed in containing this problem. And that is its ultimate historic significance. So by far, the most important thing is that we be competent and effective in responding to COVID. We have spent too little, too incompetently, with too little organization, and that is our biggest failing so far. Beyond that, there is a need, especially given how poorly we have contained COVID, to support incomes, to support families, and to support those lives that have been disrupted by COVID. Disproportionately, the burden of COVID has fallen on the most disadvantaged. That's why I was a strong supporter of the CARES Act during the worst of COVID last year. That's why I believe the $900 billion program was an important step. I believe we do need to maintain unemployment insurance. We do need to support the reopening of schools. I have said that the $1.9 trillion without a penny of long-term Build Back Better, without anything that will strengthen us for the long run with respect to China, is, I believe, a mistake on the allocation of resources, a mistake on the macroeconomic risks that it poses of overheating the economy. It may well be, quite likely, it's better than doing nothing, but I don't think it's the right, well-designed program. And I think it carries risks in terms of opportunity cost of thwarted public investment and in terms of repeating the macroeconomic scenario of the 1960s. I'm in an odd position, Bill, in these debates about fiscal policy. Somebody said that I was a little bit like a believer in the minimum wage and increasing the minimum wage, who then had to confront a proposal for a $22 temporary minimum wage. And on the one hand, it was kind of in the direction they had been advocating for years. On the other hand, it was large to the point of irresponsible. And that's how I feel about this program. But I don't think that should blind us to the fact that the economy does and will, after COVID end, have a deep structural issue that it didn't used to have.
Yeah, that's important, I think. Yeah.
And that is, Bill, that the private sector has a lot of reasons to generate more saving than before. More of the income is going to high income people. People are having longer retirements. There's more capital flowing out of developing countries as they accumulate reserves. There's more uncertainty generally. So there's an increase in the private propensity to save. At the same time, the fact that the most important technology of our time, information technology, can be bought in immense quantity for $500 in a telephone, is reducing the volume of demand for investment in a profound way. So also is the fact that the labor force of the industrial world is no longer growing. So also is the fact that our economy's undergoing what might be thought of as a process of demassification around information technology. It used to be, I read recently, that a law firm needed 1,200 square feet per lawyer. Today, because there's no need for filing cabinets, it only needs 600 square feet per lawyer. And there are lots more examples like that. And all this was probably accelerated by COVID. What that means is that balancing savings and investment at full employment is much harder than it used to be. It's the excess of saving that explains why interest rates are so chronically low. And even at near zero interest rates, there's a need to provide some further absorption of saving. And that's why I think long after COVID, the appropriate policies are going to involve more public investment than they have in the past. And I think that macroeconomic imperative fits with the microeconomic imperatives of a decaying infrastructure, the microeconomic imperatives of doing things about climate change and a variety of other needs in our society.
Yeah. So, I mean, are we back to and the private sector can't handle that, is what you're...
I'm saying the private sector doesn't have the profitable investment opportunities, given that, in effect, it can put in place so much capital at so little cost because of the tremendous progress we've had with information technology.
Okay, well, that sounds good, but why are you so confident government will know what it's doing and will do a good job of allocating these resources and won't crowd out useful private investment and won't burden us with debt and all the obvious sort of standard, but not ridiculous, conservative objections to sort of a bigger government involvement in economic policy and economic investment?
First, I would say that the argument I'm making is really an argument for a more expansionary fiscal policy. And that can be accommodated on the tax side, or it can be accommodated on the expenditure side. The macroeconomic argument is an argument for more fiscal expansion in terms of absorbing savings. Second, I look at the marginal undone public investment in the United States and the marginal undone private investment. Which is a higher social priority? A better air traffic control system. When I started flying from Boston to Washington 40 years ago, it took an hour and a quarter. Now it takes an hour and three quarters, and it hasn't gotten any further away. So I compare developing a functional air traffic control system with replacing the video entertainment on airplanes every 2 years. And I think the public sector priority is the larger one. I look at the threat of climate change, and it's hard for me to believe that there's any reason to think that without incentives to internalize that externality, the private market will get it right. And I see a need for more public activity. I look, Bill, at the fact that if you look at, here's a fact about the economy that people don't really pay attention to that I find very striking. All the consumer price indices are normalized, so they were all 100 in 1983. The consumer price index for a television set today is 6. The consumer price index for a day in a hospital or a year in a college is 600. So we've had 100-fold relative price change. And in general, those relative price changes are that the stuff that the public sector does has gotten more expensive, and the stuff that the private sector does has gotten cheaper. Manufacturing's in many ways in a transition like that of agriculture. And so the consequence of that is that the activities whose price are rising, given inelastic demand, are going to need to be a larger share of our economy than in the past. But look, I have always said on infrastructure that both parties are right. Democrats are right that we need to spend more. Republicans are right that we need to spend better, that we need not to have ludicrous delays associated with regulatory reviews, that we need to procure more efficiently, that we need to involve the private sector to a greater degree. You know, you've spent a lot of time at Harvard, Bill. There's a bridge. It's 360 feet long. It connects Cambridge and Alston, Harvard College and Harvard Business School. It needed to be repaired after 100 years. Traffic was delayed because a lane was closed for that bridge to be repaired for 62 months. 62 months. Patton built a bridge over a span of the Rhine 10 times as long in one day. Julius Caesar built a bridge over a span of the Rhine far, far longer in 9 days. And in contemporary America, it took 5 years plus to repair that bridge. And so by making a case for more public investment, I don't mean to express any degree of satisfaction with the way that investment is organized. But I think if you look sector after sector, my airline example was one. If you say, should we be investing in better information technology so that people's medical records can follow them where they go? Or should we be investing in marginal private sector operated sports medicine clinics? It's hard to believe that the marginal investment that's more desirable is the private sector investment. Look, a simple way to put this is prices tell you something about value. And the fact that the market is clearing with people paying to borrow in the private sector at a negative real rate, what that's telling you is that as judged by these participants, the marginal project on a risk-adjusted return basis has a very, very low return. That's not my social policy judgment. That's what Milton Friedman, hard-headed economics, look at the price of capital and what people are willing to pay for it, is telling you. And so it seems to me that you have to respond to that market signal.
I want to come back maybe to the pure economics, but just I'm so struck by your formulation because it would seem like there would be therefore perhaps a centrist alliance possible on public sector investment for public goods, for externalities, for things that presumably the private sector doesn't have the ability or an incentive to fix by itself. No one set of physicians or hospitals going to fix medical record, records being transferable everywhere, et cetera. So public sector investment, but also public sector reform, because that 62 months on the bridge from Cambridge to Alston, I bet a lot of that has to do with how procurement is done by Cambridge and Alston authorities in Massachusetts. Some of it has to do with excessive, I'm making this up, environmental statements they've got to file. Some of it has to do with unions and other such things, work rules and so forth. So I'm just curious. You've been in politics as well as economics. Don't you think that is is that sitting out there for someone to grasp? Is it going to be grasped?
I'd have been a very enthusiastic supporter of a 1.9 trillion or heck 2.9 trillion Build America Back Better as we respond to COVID initial program that had those things as its elements. I think there is room in the center for that. I think, and you understand this better than I, we have an increasingly polarized politics where for most members of Congress and the Senate, the risks to their electoral durability comes more from their flanks than it does from the other side. And that makes it more difficult to reach the kind of centrist approach that you and I are both describing. And look, I have a lot of sympathy with the administration. It is very difficult to imagine a lot of compromising and doing business with people who are prepared to assert not just that Donald Trump should have won the election, but in the face of all evidence and facts that Donald Trump did win the election. I think there was a reasonable argument for a long time that lack of bipartisanship was a bipartisan sin. I think the behavior of the Republican Party and so much of the Republican Party has been so egregious that it has made it very difficult to be a moderate, bipartisan oriented Democrat. There's a shortage of people to do business with, and there's a sense that the power centers of the party are in a very different place. But yes, over time, I hope that there is space for that. But I can't say I'm hugely optimistic in the near term. And I have to say, as I've watched the way the Republican Party conducted itself in the wake of the election and in the wake of January 6th, it is much easier for me to understand the view of and to sympathize with the view of more hardcore progressives.
Yeah, I'm not going to in any way defend, obviously, the Republican behavior. It's appalling, and I'm probably even more pessimistic than you about the Republicans. I would say that from the Biden administration's own point of view, though, and from the Democratic Party's point of view, to be honest, if they're going to do a big, as they are going to do, a big relief package, and if they're then going to do a big infrastructure package, which I assume they are, maybe a little smaller than you would have liked because they've used up a little more on the payments from the in the 1.9 trillion. It's sort of important that it works pretty well. I mean, and that would in turn imply that they have a certain self-interest even in some of these reforms of the public sector at the same time as they go ahead with some what might be important and useful and necessary expenditures from the public sector.
I think, look, I think that's right, and I'm sympathetic sympathetic to that. I think that, the First Avenue subway costs 7 times in New York City, costs 7 times as much to build per kilometer as the French metro in Paris. And French procurement is not usually regarded as legendarily efficient. So I think there are a set of problems there. I am all for meeting our legitimate national security needs. And I think the issue of dependence and its dangers and the issue of lack of resilience has probably not received the attention in economics that it should. But every time I hear a Buy America, Concentrate Supply in America program defended on job creation grounds, I wince, because that is asking for more inefficiency than we need to have. So I think that's right. I think, in fairness to the president, my assessment, and I think the general assessment 12 years later, is that while you can debate whether the scale should have been larger, in retrospect, it should have been larger, while you can debate particular aspects, the high-speed railway between Fresno and somewhere obviously was not a successful investment. I think in general, the execution on the Recovery Act, which the vice president was really the person who presided over, I think most people who are fair-minded in either party would say it was quite good. So I think it will be important to watch deeds as we execute. But I just hope that when we are facing what I think really is an existential challenge in the economic area from a rising China, that our efforts will be focused not so much on confronting China's power, but on making sure that our example wins in fair-minded comparisons. And I think if you look at the responses to COVID, if you look at the experiences in airports, if you look at the experiences on trains, if you look at levels of educational achievement, if you look at progress in national prowess in key technologies, we have very substantial grounds for concern.
No, I think that's well said, and and I do think, I think the Biden administration will try to can frame if they can frame this more as a national endeavor to do what we should be doing, and a little less as kind of a big government liberal program. That would probably help them a little bit.
I think, look, it distresses me, and I don't think it's the preserve of one political party or not. But, the first political rhetoric that I ever heard and half understood and sort of grew up with was John Kennedy asking people to consider not what their country could do for them, but what they could do for their country. And that's a philosophy of leadership. And the philosophy of a middle-class Bill of Rights is a very different philosophy. It's not just that you should ask what your country should do for you, but that you've got a right to have your country do everything for you. And I don't think that evolution from ask not politics to middle-class Bill of Rights politics has been a healthy one for the country. And I'm sorry to see it perpetuated. And I think very much perpetuated in so much of our political our political rhetoric today. And I think that the absence of national goals of greatness is part of what contributes to the polarization. It's part of what contributes to the sharpness of the divisions across different groups in our politics. And so I think a politics of common purpose needs to supplement and maybe even supplant a politics of middle-class entitlement.
Yeah, or a politics of competitive victimization, which I think, I mean, I'm old enough to remember when Republicans kind of looked down on the Democrats as the party that treats people as victims who need help, and we're the party of, self-sufficient, moving ahead. And now the Republicans have jumped over the Democrats, I would say, in pandering to a sense, and not just pandering, but exaggerating and amplifying people's anxieties and some sense of victimhood, some of which is, of course, legitimate. I mean, but and as you say, if you get into that dynamic of competitive victimization, it's not healthy. I mean, I want to come back. You mentioned trade and immigration, or trade, and I want to also add immigration. I want to come back to those because I've gotten more radicalized on those two in the opposite direction, I'd say, of where both parties are going. So I don't know quite what that suggests, but just quickly, the obvious the obvious questions about your general stance on government and overcoming secular stagnation, as you called it for several years. Debt, is there a risk of just taking on too much government debt? Is that and inflation? I guess those are the two obvious kind of standard kind of question marks.
So look, I think you obviously have to think carefully about debt, but the way prudent households think about debt is they think about what they're borrowing for and is it productive? That's one thing they think about. Another thing they think about is debt relative to assets. If you're buying a house, you tend to ask two questions. You tend to ask, how big is the mortgage relative to the value of the house? And you tend to ask, how much are your monthly payments relative to your income? And those are probably better measures of what kind of mortgage you should take than if you take your debt to your income. And in the same way, when we think about government debt, Jason Furman and I have argued, we should think about debt service relative to income. We should think about debt relative to our asset, which is the present value of our future tax revenues, which goes up when the discount factor goes down with lower interest rates. So yeah, I think we should worry about debt, but I think we should measure debt in a sensible way, in the same way, with the same logic that households would use or that companies would use. And I think if we do it prudently and we do it to invest in productive things, there's more room today than there used to be because of these forces that have led to lower cost of borrowing is one way to say it. Another is a lower opportunity cost of public investment in terms of the return from private investment, since private returns have gone down. Inflation, look, I think we're not in a good place as a country right now in terms of inflation. We haven't had inflation for 40 years. There have been inflation scares at a variety of points. Many of your political allies were hugely alarmed in 2009 and 2010 that the Fed's balance sheet was going to cause.
QE2, QEN. No, I was one of those who was alarmed, and I was wrong.
Suspected you were. I suspected you were, Bill. But
well, I'm a child of the 60s and 70s, and I
wasn't going to accuse you of it.
No, it's okay. But let me put the question this way: as a child of the 60s,
I would be able to say of myself that I've been wrong about plenty of things, that I was not worried that Ronald Reagan's deficits would cause inflation,
right? Because
I thought the dollar would appreciate given the monetary policies of that time. I was not worried in the mid-1990s when many were, because I saw Alan Greenspan's view about an increase in productivity. I had the proper understanding of Federal Reserve balance sheets, and so I was not worried in 2009 and 2010. And when Ben Bernanke and Janet Yellen started raising rates, I thought there was still a fair amount of slack in the economy in prospect. And so I thought they should go slower and not preempt based on the Phillips curve. So I have been an inflation non-alarmist. Having said that, what I now see with an economy that, without this $1.9 trillion stimulus, would be making its way back pretty close to its potential by the end of this year. We're putting 9% of GDP in fiscal stimulus, and the Fed's got its foot on the accelerator as hard as it can. And the Fed's saying that it doesn't even regard inflation as the primary worry in the current moment. I think we are doing the 1960s. And the principal difference between what we're doing now and the 1960s is that the fiscal policy is far larger and the Fed is far more accommodative relative to the 1960s. And the current generation of economists has decided that inflation is something that happens very slowly and gradually and can easily be dealt with. Well, if you actually go back and look, inflation went from the 2 range in 1966 to the 6 range in 1969 in 3 years, despite policymakers having awakened to it and started to try to control it a year and a half into it. So the idea that if you produce an overheat, it's somehow easily dealt with, I don't know why anybody thinks that's true. And so I am very concerned about inflation. But I'm concerned about inflation as a consequence of the completely extraordinary 2/3 of the way to World War II fiscal policy that we're pursuing right now. As a general matter, and if we get past this and things return to normal, then I think the issues that were there from 2012 to 2020 of this natural force of savings exceeding investment tending to hold inflation down will again reassert themselves. But I also think that this idea that we should be mechanical about inflation targeting, I don't think was right. I mean, the idea that it's somehow a critical problem that requires the Fed to act, that inflation is at 1.7% rather than 2%, is not one to which I relate. I think the frankly more old-fashioned way, which is the Fed should use its judgment to pursue price stability and full employment to the maximum extent possible, is actually a sounder approach to monetary policy than elaborate numerical frameworks.
Yeah, I mean, as a child of the late 60s and 70s, of course, I do have that kind of instinctive response. You get accommodating fiscal policy, guns and butter, and then you have the Fed accommodating monetary policy, and hey, we know what follows from that. And I think as you suggested, but just to put the dot that I and cross that T, it's not like dealing with inflation once it starts to get a little out of control is painless, right? I mean, of course, the Fed could ultimately deal with it. Paul Volcker dealt with it ultimately, but it was not a fun 3 or 4 years of dealing with inflation in the late 70s or into through 1982. I mean, so the notion that it's sort of not something to worry about or not a risky thing to just kind of, that it's not, you're not playing a little bit with fire, I think is true. And it doesn't negate the broader point you make that yes, the inflation worries have been wrong for 30, 40 years. And maybe those underlying conditions continue to hold. I mean, what do you think how worried are you though in the short term? Is the short term, as Keynes, short terms matter, right? I mean, how worried are you that
I think
in the short, medium term, we have a little bit of a late 60s problem? Do you think that's?
I think there is a significant risk. We will be thinking about pressures on the dollar, long-term rates, moving up on significant inflation expectations, consequence of a Fed behind the curve. Can a soft landing be engineered given euphoria in financial markets? I think there's a significant risk. Is it 40%? Is it 60%? Is it 30%? I don't know. But people who think it's a remote risk, or people who think that somehow it's a greater risk, that as the economy, Goldman Sachs predicts that it's going to grow at 8% this year. The Atlanta Fed says that the first quarter growth rate could be 9.5. I don't think that's right, but that is what the Atlanta Fed says, that in that economy with 9% of GDP fiscal stimulus, people who are saying that the greater risk is a turn to deflation and an immediate turn to deflation, I don't see how a reasonable person could be making that claim. And I don't think anybody will be able to make that. I think it's unlikely that people will be able to make that claim 9 months from now.
And do you think if we all get a little bit alarmed in the summer, fall of 2021, the Fed, the administration can we get to a soft landing? Do we know enough, and is the political system nimble enough to handle this in a competent way while doing what you want in terms of infrastructure and obviously other obligations? I think
Bill, you're right to distinguish those two aspects. Is the problem? I think there are three aspects actually. Once you have a bit of overheat going, are there a set of adjustments possible that prove to generate smoothness in the response? Question one. Question two, if there are there any set of technocrats who can be relied on to figure them out correctly? And, like they're better technocrats than worse technocrats, but I have not met any technocrat in any sphere who's close to infallible. And third, even if you thought there was a solution and the technocrats could identify it reliably, will the political system be able to implement the right technocratic solution? And it seems to me if you add together those three risks, things may well work out, but you wouldn't want to be betting heavily that they would work out. And again, why are we taking this extra bit of overheat risk? Are we taking it because it's necessary to provide relief for COVID? No. Disposable income, purchasing power of the bottom fifth of Americans will be a third larger this year than anybody would have imagined it would be without COVID. Are we taking it in order to make fundamental public investments? No. Are we taking it to do a lot of things that people think are kind of desirable? I guess that's what we're doing. I found it remarkable that Paul Krugman defended the program by saying that the multiplier will be small because consumers will improve their balance sheets. Is it really the right priority with all the issues that the United States faces, poverty, climate change, decaying infrastructure, rising foreign threats, being ready for the next pandemic? Is major public outlays on the scale of far larger than the Social Security Disability Program, approaching the size of the Social Security Program, directed at improving consumer balance sheets, really a wise priority? I kind of doubt it.
I mean, the truth is, if one were hostile to your vision, if I can put it this way, of a bigger and more active public sector, and really doing a lot of investing for the future in public goods and so forth, one could argue this is a pretty good way to thwart that. I mean, let's give a lot of money to people. Let's give a lot of money to state and local governments. It'll take up the ability to kind of give out money, so to speak. There won't be that much left for investment. We can claw some of that money back, with some like tax increases, probably in a year or two for the upper middle class who will have gotten more than they need. We can give a little less money to state and local governments in the future because they're probably going to have excess cash, honestly, after this thing gets through, and the school systems will have some money, which may be good. But in a funny way, and you've made this argument, it's a two-step argument, so it's hard for the political system to grasp it. I mean, if one really were a small L liberal who believes in the public sector and public goods and so forth, it's not clear that this is going to leave money for that, right?
Let me try to state what you just said, Bill, in the slightly starker terms that I've thought about it. There's a famous Republican starve the beast with tax cuts strategy. There is an element in what we're doing of starve the beast with increased transfer payments. In what we're doing. Now, I think the comparison's unfair because the general advocacy is that this is one time, which is a very sharp difference. So the way to feel more comfortable is that this will be a one-time thing. If I didn't hear so many of my friends say that this first 1.9 trillion was a foundation for a new attack on inequity and a new move towards progressivity, it's a little hard to see how it could be both one time and a foundation. So I am nervous and apprehensive about that. But look, I think the optimistic case is that this will be genuinely one time, that it will kickstart the economy, that as has happened in the past, it will turn out that a strong economy finds potential it didn't know it had. And so capacity is greater than we imagine. And by being demanded, we create capacity. That increased capacity makes room for the absence of inflationary pressures, and that we're then in a position to engage in capacity enhancing investment in a jump-started economy with prudent approaches to paying for it, based heavily on progressive taxation, which produces more fairness. And that ultimately, this is remembered as a very successful kickstart for the economy. And I think that is the hopeful vision of this. I think the trade-off is being struck substantially too far in favor of excessive scale on this and delay on the investment. But there is a strategy, and it's an understandable strategy, and it involves a careful and thoughtful balancing of risk by the people who are undertaking it.
You mentioned in passing Buy American, and it leads me to ask you, how worried are you about trade or globalization, the attacks on globalization in general, which are in particular on trade, free trade, more or less free trade, and also on immigration, on a liberal attitude, let's say, towards immigration, including high skill immigration? From my point of view, and I suspect we agree on this, those are two pretty big positive features of our economy, and have done a heck of a lot of good over decades. And there's how worried are you that both parties actually are going to be in a fairly suboptimal place in terms of trade policy and immigration? I did a conversation with Scott Lincecum, who's a kind of libertarian lawyer, economist, who really was, very interesting on the vaccine. If you look at the vaccines, if you want a little case study and why you should be for global investment and also sort of high skill immigration, and if you want to produce things that actually help people, the vaccine development is a pretty interesting, good case study of that. I think also for small businesses and large businesses working together and so forth. But I don't feel like either party has really internalized that lesson at this point. And or do you think this is sort of marginal, and basically we continue with a kind of globalized and system and a reasonable immigration policies?
So there are a number of parts to that, Bill.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. Take whichever ones you want, but yeah.
I think it's very important that we resist protectionism. And I think if we start becoming substantially more protectionist, we'll end up screwing up our exports, screwing up our consumers, depressing real wages, and hurting our economy.
And do you think under Trump we went much in that direction, or just a little?
We moved meaningfully too much, but not massively too much during the Trump administration. So I think that's a mistake. I look at the content of the concessions we're seeking from other countries in new trade agreements, and I can't say they are enormously exciting to me. They are mostly concessions on the basis of four global corporations whose production is mostly not anchored in the United States. And I think there's a real question as to how much political capital should be spent to get Wall Street banks extra branches in Asian countries. I think there's a real question as to how much American political capital should be spent to get the Disney Corporation an extra 50 years of trademark protection on Mickey Mouse. So I look at what we're fighting for in these trade agreements, and I think it's not what Adam Smith and David Ricardo were talking about. I think most of the time, I think we've got the better side of the argument, but should we be investing huge political capital in them? I'm a bit less, it's the end of the world if we're not fighting for new trade agreements, than some of my friends are. I'd rather see us fighting to manage globalization by avoiding races to the bottom in corporate taxation and races to the bottom in regulation. I'd rather see that as our global integration agenda than one that is so explicitly commercial. On immigration, I think we do need, I'm not an expert on immigration policy by any stretch. I have a politically incorrect view on this as well. I think we need more generous immigration policy for people who want to come to America and be Americans.
Yeah, well,
but
I'm with you, but we're in a minority these days.
I think that there's a kind of concept of immigration where people are going to be encouraged to speak their native languages rather than English, and where assimilation is a dirty word. And I think that's going to complicate cohesion in America in very profound ways. So I would like to see stronger immigration policies, and I think we'd be better off with more immigration. I think the available evidence suggests that it largely benefits American workers. But I wouldn't, but I do think there is this aspect around immigration, which is kind of one world and loss of American identity, that I do have concerns about it. There, I would have views closer to people who on most issues are more conservative than I am.
Yeah, interesting. Let me ask you one last economics question, and unless there's other stuff we want to raise, and then we'll talk about higher education for 5-10 minutes, which we actually did a whole conversation on a couple of years ago, and which you have thought a lot about. But on economics, I mean, how much reading some of your paper with Jason Furman and some of the reactions to it, and I can't quite decide, are we having a sort of traditional debate with some new evidence and data in a slightly new world about economic policy, or are we kind of in uncharted waters? I mean, how much are we in a really new world where sort of the kind of instincts and even the lessons we think we learned in the 60s and 70s or the 80s and 90s or whatever really are kind of misleading as often as not, and we just need to rethink a ton of things? I mean, I that's maybe too general a way to put it, but I'm curious where on the spectrum you would be on this.
I'm confused about that, and here's why I'm confused. 6 months ago, I thought I knew the answer to that question. I thought an era of excess savings rather than an era of excess demand was profoundly different. And just as the 1930s had ushered in a new economics, and just as the 1970s inflation had ushered in a new economics, I thought we were in need of new ways of thinking about macroeconomic policy. My friend Olivier Blanchard and I, he's the former chief economist of the IMF and a very distinguished professor at MIT, now at the Peterson Institute, co-authored a book, co-edited a volume, and in the final chapter, the book was entitled Evolution or Revolution. And he favored evolution and I favored revolution in macroeconomic thinking. And I think I still believe that as the right way to think about things over the long term. But something that I would have judged kind of inconceivable, which is that in a macroeconomically normal-ish economy, an economy that looks like not great, but looks like 2015 or 2016, we're talking about having fiscal stimulus of a double-digit percentage of GDP. And that's not something I could have imagined would happen. And it's a combination of COVID and a particular political configuration and COVID recovery happening faster than people have expected. And so I think the lessons of the 1960s are right now the relevant lessons again. My guess is this episode will work its way through, and then the lessons of what I called for years the secular stagnation, and I've come to start calling savings absorption as the central macroeconomic problem, are again going to be the crucial ones, and we're going to need a lot of profound new thinking. But I see that all much less clearly than I did a year ago or a year and a half ago because of the extraordinary nature of current policies.
That's interesting and very clarifying. And I've been confused at a more amateur level than you, and I'm glad to be reassured that my being uncertain and about this isn't just weakness, but that there's genuine uncertainty about how to think about this, how to think about this moment. Higher education. Evolution or revolution? I mean, what do you make of what's happening? Everyone's gone through a year of that no one expected, and presumably it'll have real effects and maybe intensify trends that were already happening. But I'll let you talk about it. You've been giving this a lot of thought.
I'm going to make one point. There's a lot one could say about.
We'll have a separate conversation on this.
About about higher education, and that is this. The leading institutions in the country are important because they're the leading institutions in the country in ways that are completely disproportionate to their scale, because for better or for worse, they are widely watched. And I think they have to make a very profound decision, which I don't think they have faced up to. And the question is, are they going to be to higher education what Augusta is to golf? Glorious because of their exclusivity, defining their greatness by the fraction of the people they exclude, and making important gestures to social concern, like the very generous financial aid policies that I put in place when I was president of Harvard that let anyone with a family income less than $60,000 come for free. I was really proud to have done that, and I think it's changed Harvard in very profound ways, but it's 100 students, an extra 100 students, an extra 200 students each year when 3 million American kids come out of high school each year. And I was very proud that most of the Ivy League emulated it. And so maybe it gets up to 1,000 kids. What's now possible with technology is for the kind of teaching and the kind of pedagogy that those institutions can provide to be made available to anyone, anywhere, to talented high school kids in West Virginia and Hamlets, to those who weren't able to start college and yet are profoundly curious in their mid 40s, to those who are examples of education so great it's wasted on the young, who want to learn about American history in evenings as they didn't want to when they were young, to people all over the world. Do these institutions want to define their greatness by the number of people they reach or by the number of people they exclude? That's a profound question for them, and it's a profound question for the society as it pushes on them. Does the society want to obsess over their admissions policies for 1,600 students a year? Do they want to obsess over whether it's called the English department or the Department of English Language Literature? Do they want to obsess about the details of the curriculum? Or does it want to challenge those institutions to reach as broadly as it can? This is not hypothetical. My wife, through Harvard and now on a substantially larger scale through Arizona State, has taught poetry based on her television show to selected, but to disadvantaged kids in public schools in some of the toughest neighborhoods in the country, taught the course she teaches in the Harvard Extension School. And those kids have been able to complete that course. Michael Sandel has offered his famous justice class at Harvard to very large audiences. So I think what's ultimately going to be the most important question these leading institutions face: do they choose the Augusta mentality, or do they choose to try to use what they have to reach the whole world? And I hope, but do not necessarily expect, that they will reach that they will try to reach as widely as possible. And the institutions that I admire most are the institutions like Southern New Hampshire, like Arizona State, like a number of others who really are trying to embrace the philosophy of education for all. Let's face it, Bill, people who grew up in the kind of homes that you grew up in, or the kind of home that I grew up in, we'll make our way through. Better and more special, with better climbing walls and more counselors for the young versions of us, is not what's going to determine the future of the country. And I hope that higher education, as it puzzles over why there seems to be so much antipathy to it in so many political places, can understand that it needs to broaden its reach.
Yeah, that's well said. One reason we started these conversations, obviously, is a very similar sense. And I think that one key point is it does not have to be, I mean, I'm all for also, public education that will be, so it has to be somewhat adjusted to people's capabilities and backgrounds, but you can have extremely high level. Paul Cantor teaches the same Shakespeare. We put his Shakespeare course that he taught at Harvard, and he teaches normally at UVA, online. And I've done conversations with him, and it's got a big audience from a lot of people, as you say, ranging from 17-year-olds abroad to 70-year-olds here at home, and who have written us and are very grateful and excited. And I very much agree that people are underestimating the ability of a kind of elite education, if using elite in the good term, elite open to everyone, but not necessarily in everyone's interest or to their taste or to their ability, frankly, but still making that available widely online is a hugely ambitious, would be a great thing really for the country and for the world. Yeah, do you think most of the elite institutions of higher education and the people involved in that see this opportunity, or are they in a little more of a defensive crouch against, pushing back against critics and tinkering, as you sort of suggested, with their admission formulas or with speech codes or something?
I think there's tremendous positive energy. We're spending the winter as it happens in Arizona, and I see the kinds of things that Arizona State is doing. I think there's tremendous positive energy around these themes, but I don't think a large fraction of it is coming from the leaders. And maybe that shouldn't be surprising. My late Harvard colleague, Clay Christensen, famously studied disruptive innovation. And a central conclusion of his work was the unlikelihood of disruptive innovation coming from existing leaders.
Yeah, Google and Apple are not IBM and Sears. I mean,
exactly.
It's not an accident that they're new companies. Not some of it came out of older companies, but not much of it. I guess the question is, are there barriers to entry and so forth in higher ed that make, in effect, what's happened in information technology so impossible? I used to think yes, and now I'm a little less certain, but I don't know.
I think I also think that higher ed perceives itself to be in a very complex financial situation. The revenue available from very large scale education empowered by technology is immense. And so there's that interest as well that should motivate them. But, Bill, and this is a different subject, and it's something I feel strongly about. Given my experiences, many people would probably not regard me as a disinterested observer on the question, and they'd probably be right. Universities are run by their faculties. Economics has studied pretty extensively the incentives of worker-controlled firms. And what economic theory suggests is that worker-controlled firms tend to die out because they are always concerned that if you take more people on the boat, it's all going to be split more and be less comfortable for the incumbents. And so you need owned firms to have real dynamism and expansion. Israeli kibbutzes died out. The Yugoslav economy isn't there anymore. Worker-run firms are a small part of the American economy. And so as long as universities are basically run by their faculties, I suspect that a whole set of incentives are going to operate for security and comfort rather than dynamism and change. And I think that is utter heresy in academia to raise a question about that. But there's things you can see. If you look at medical schools where the budgets are really big and sums of money are involved and it's life and death and it's really serious, hiring is not done by a vote of the members of the hematology department. Hiring is done by the chair of the hematology department. And of course, the sensible chair will very extensively consult with the members of the hematology department, but it's not that each member of the hematology department has a block on an innovative appointment. In classic liberal arts, faculties of arts and sciences, those kinds of thoughts are heretical. And I'm not sure whether they're going to change. And that's why there may be more disruptive innovation that comes from the outside.
Well, this is a great, we need to have a whole conversation on this. We're very interested in this. It's one reason we do conversations. So let's have that conversation in 2 or 3 months. And maybe by then, 4 or 5 months, we'll also know what we should think a little more about the economy and how worried we should be. But thank you, really. This has been very interesting. Any last thoughts you want to leave anyone with?
No, thank you very much, Bill.
No, it's great. So thank you, Larry, for this conversation. And we look forward to the next one. And thank you for joining us on Conversations.